England, in the year 1758, was home to a millinery business operating on Bruton Street in Hanover Square, London. The establishment was run by Mrs. Sarah Metyard, a 40-year-old widow who managed the enterprise alongside her daughter, Miss Sarah Morgan Metyard, commonly known as Sally. The shop specialized in fashionable headwear and accessories and was known locally as a successful and reputable place of trade. To neighbors and customers, the household appeared orderly, respectable, and financially stable. Mrs. Metyard and her daughter were well regarded within the surrounding community. Their business showed no outward signs of disorder or misconduct, and there was nothing in their public conduct that suggested cruelty or abuse. The millinery workshop functioned not only as a place of commerce, but also as a residence, housing several young girls who worked under Mrs. Metyard's authority. At the time, Mrs. Metyard employed 5 apprentice girls, all of whom had been bound to her through parish workhouses. These apprentices lived and worked within the household, learning the trade while remaining under strict supervision. Their presence was consistent with common practices of the period and did not attract suspicion. To observers, the arrangement reflected a structured and lawful system in which disadvantaged girls were provided with skills and employment. This outward appearance of respectability concealed the private reality of the household. While the millinery shop prospered and maintained its reputation, the conditions endured by those inside remained unseen. The orderly facade presented to the neighborhood would later stand in stark contrast to the events that unfolded within the walls of the Bruton Street residence. In mid-18th century England, parish apprenticeship was a common system designed to place disadvantaged children into trades. Apprentices were frequently drawn from parish workhouses, where legal agreements were prepared to formalize their placement. These documents typically outlined terms lasting 7 years and defined the obligations of both the master and the apprentice. The parish acted as an intermediary, overseeing the transfer of the child into the care of the employer. Under this system, apprentices were expected to learn their trade through daily practical experience. Upon completing their term, they were often granted independence, sometimes accompanied by money or tools to support their future livelihood. In theory, the arrangement benefited employers, parishes, and the children themselves by providing structure, training, and opportunity. However, the system also created conditions of vulnerability. Apprentices were usually young, dependent, and isolated from family support. Those taken from workhouses or orphanages had little power to challenge their treatment. Although local authorities were meant to regulate apprenticeships and prevent exploitation, oversight was frequently limited. Mistreatment could remain hidden behind the closed doors of workshops and homes. When abuse occurred, it was often difficult for outsiders to detect, and intervention was rare. Parishes sometimes lacked the resources or willingness to investigate complaints, particularly when harsh discipline was widely accepted as part of training. As a result, apprentices like those employed by Mrs. Metyard had few protections. Their dependence on their masters and mistresses left them exposed to neglect and cruelty, with little recourse if conditions became unbearable. Among the 5 apprentices employed by Mrs. Metyard was a young girl named Anne Naylor. Anne was 13 years old and worked alongside her sister in the millinery household. She was known to be physically frail and often unwell, described as sickly and weak in constitution. Unlike the other apprentices, Anne struggled to maintain the demanding pace of work expected of her. This inability to keep up made Anne particularly vulnerable. Her physical weakness drew the attention of Mrs. Metyard, who responded not with patience, but with punishment. Anne was frequently disciplined for her perceived slowness and inability to meet expectations. These punishments were severe and consistent, rather than isolated incidents. At times, Anne was confined to an upper room within the house. While isolated there, she was provided only minimal sustenance, consisting of small pieces of bread and limited water each day. The deprivation compounded her already fragile health, leaving her increasingly weakened. To those outside the household, Mrs. Metyard appeared to be a respectable employer. The business maintained its standing, and no concerns were publicly raised. Inside the home, however, Anne endured repeated mistreatment that went unseen. Her suffering occurred away from public view, hidden by the reputation of the establishment. Anne's treatment reflected a pattern of cruelty rather than discipline. Her frailty, instead of earning compassion, resulted in harsher punishment. This ongoing abuse set the conditions that would ultimately lead her to attempt escape from the household. One early morning, Anne Naylor attempted to escape the millinery workshop on Bruton Street. She rose quietly from the bedroom she shared with the other apprentices, descended the stairs, and carefully opened the front door. With no money and no clear destination, she stepped onto Bruton Street, leaving the house behind. Anne sought assistance from a milk carrier named Mr. Brown. She pleaded with him for protection, expressing fear of returning to Mrs. Metyard's house and warning that she faced danger if forced back. Mr. Brown listened, but had his own duties to attend to. Unable or unwilling to intervene, he did not offer shelter or protection. Without support, Anne's options were limited. The reality of life on the streets offered no safety, and returning to the parish workhouse system provided little assurance of relief. Her escape, though desperate, was unsustainable. Miss Sally Metyard soon located Anne and forcibly brought her back to the millinery workshop. The return was swift and decisive, ending any hope Anne had of avoiding further punishment. Her unannounced departure angered Mrs. Metyard deeply. This incident marked a turning point. Anne's attempt to flee was interpreted as defiance, and the response was severe. The forced return placed her once again under the authority of her abusers, and the consequences would be far more brutal than before. The escape, brief and unsuccessful, directly preceded the most violent phase of her mistreatment. After Anne Naylor was brought back to the millinery house, the punishment inflicted upon her escalated dramatically. Miss Sally Metyard seized the girl, threw her onto a bed, and beat her with the handle of a broom. Anne was then taken to another room, where a cord was tightly wound around her waist, and her hands were bound behind her back. She was fastened to a door in a position that prevented her from sitting or lying down. Anne remained restrained in this manner for 3 consecutive days. During this time, she was deprived of food and water for 3 days and 2 nights. Although she was allowed to retire to bed during customary evening hours, the lack of nourishment and the physical strain rapidly weakened her. Her strength deteriorated to the point where she could no longer climb the stairs and was forced to crawl. The other apprentices worked in an adjoining room and could hear Anne's cries and distress. They were explicitly forbidden from offering assistance and were threatened with the same punishment if they intervened. Fear kept them silent. On the 4th day, Anne's speech began to falter, and her cries gradually ceased. Her body hung limp, suspended by the restraints. When the apprentices alerted Miss Sally that Anne was no longer moving, she ran upstairs and struck the girl on the head with a shoe heel. There was no response. Mrs. Metyard was summoned and ordered the restraints cut. Anne was placed across her lap, and an attempt was made to revive her using hartshorn drops. When these efforts failed, it became clear that Anne Naylor was dead. Her death was the direct result of prolonged assault and starvation. Believing Anne Naylor to be dead, Mrs. Metyard and her daughter immediately sought to conceal what had occurred. They carried Anne's body into the attic, placing it out of sight from the rest of the household. Knowing that their actions had caused her death, they began devising a plan to avoid discovery. The other apprentices were told that Anne had suffered a fit, but had since recovered. They were informed that she was being kept locked in the attic so she would not attempt to run away again. This explanation was presented firmly, discouraging questions or concern. To support this account, Miss Sally Metyard later carried a plate of meat upstairs at midday, stating that it was intended for Anne's dinner. The gesture was meant to give credibility to the claim that Anne was still alive and merely confined. Eventually, Anne's body was placed inside a chest and locked away in the attic. When days passed without Anne's appearance, the apprentices were instructed to search the house. After failing to find her, they reported back to Mrs. Metyard. Mrs. Metyard then declared that Anne had always been unruly and must have run away again. She ordered the apprentices to speak no more about the matter. Through deception and authority, the household was silenced, and suspicion was suppressed, allowing the crime to remain hidden. Approximately 2 months after Anne Naylor's death, Mrs. Metyard decided the body could no longer remain hidden. The attic door had remained sealed, partially masking the odor from the chest, but fear of discovery grew. On the evening of December 25th, Mrs. Metyard, assisted by her daughter, dismembered the body. The head and torso were wrapped together in one cloth, while the limbs, except for one hand, were bundled separately. The single hand was placed into the fire, during which Mrs. Metyard stated that the fire tells no tales. She initially considered burning all the remains but feared the smell would attract attention. Instead, later that night, mother and daughter carried the wrapped body parts to Chick Lane. Their intention was to throw them into the common sewer through a gully hole. Unable to complete this task, they left the bundles in mud and water near the sewer grate. Around midnight, a watchman discovered the remains and alerted a constable. The fragments were collected and taken to the watch house. The following day, the discovery was reported to the local coroner, Mr. Umfreville. After examining the evidence presented, the coroner concluded that the remains were likely taken from a graveyard for medical purposes. Based on this assumption, he declined to summon a jury or pursue further investigation. No inquiry followed, and the matter was dismissed. As a result, the murder of Anne Naylor went officially unrecognized. The remains were misidentified, and responsibility was never assigned. Through error and assumption, justice failed, allowing those responsible to remain free for several more years. 4 years passed before the truth of Anne Naylor's death emerged. During this time, tensions within the Metyard household intensified. Mrs. Metyard and her daughter were frequently in conflict, with accusations and blame escalating. Miss Sally, despite being of age, began to suffer regular beatings from her mother. In moments of distress, she made threats and hinted at her mother's crimes. Eventually, word of the affair reached the overseers of Tottenham Parish. Both women were arrested and confined in Newgate Prison. On July 14, 1762, Mrs. Sarah Metyard and Miss Sally Metyard were formally indicted for the willful and malicious murder of Anne Naylor. Due to hostility between them, prison authorities kept mother and daughter separated. Witnesses testified during the trial. Apprentice Philadelphia Dowley described Anne's confinement, starvation, and abuse. Milkman Mr. Brown recounted Anne's plea for help and her forced return. Miss Sally admitted knowledge of the crime, claiming she had acted under her mother's dominance, though testimony confirmed her active participation. The trial concluded on July 17th. Both women were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The executions of Mrs. Sarah Metyard and Miss Sally Metyard took place on July 19, 1762. On the day of execution, Mrs. Metyard was placed in the cart, but appeared unconscious. No attempt was made to revive her, and the executioner allowed her to die in that state. Miss Sally Metyard, in contrast, was visibly distressed. Throughout the journey from Newgate Prison to the place of execution, she cried continuously and showed clear signs of fear. Her emotional state remained unchanged until the sentence was carried out. After their deaths, the bodies of both women were left hanging for several hours. They were later transported to Surgeons' Hall, where they were displayed as public exhibits. The bodies drew the attention of onlookers before being subjected to dissection. In the years that followed, the case of Anne Naylor and the crimes committed on Bruton Street were widely recounted. The story endured as an example of cruelty concealed behind respectability. It served as a reminder that abuse could exist within seemingly orderly households. The events were remembered as a reflection of the darker realities of apprenticeship and authority in the 18th century. Anne Naylor's death became a testament to the consequences of unchecked power and the delayed reach of justice.